Now this year, 2019, from about May through to the late autumn, I'm hoping to do a lot more bass fishing. That is a lot more bass fishing than I've done over the last couple of years. So I'm hoping for a mix of bait fishing and lure fishing. So what I thought I would do, and this is mainly for those of you that are fairly new to bass fishing, is look at some of the rigs that I found to be my most successful over many, many years in different situations. But rather than just look at the rigs, I want to talk about the why and the when I would use them. So I'm going to look at 3 rigs, 3 bait rigs and 1 lure rig or 1 lure setup. Now, before I start talking about the rigs, I just want to say one thing, and again this is mainly for beginners. 95% of bass fishing is done at short range. Bass absolutely love to come into very shallow water or relatively shallow water to feed. They love it, and they'll come right into water only about that deep. Therefore, a lot of the shore bass fishing really doesn't require distance casting. There are occasions when you may want to place a bait which is quite a long way out by a particular feature like some rocks or something, or when lure fishing you may want to cast the lure and work it over a reef that's a fair way out. But the majority, in general, the majority of bass are caught within 60 yards. In fact, sometimes you will be amazed at the distance you are from dry land that you'll actually hook a bass. So that's just one thing to emphasize for those of you that are fairly new. Now the first rig that I want to talk about is this rig. The very, very simple but very, very effective running ledger. Now this rig has been used for years and it's caught loads of different species of fish, whether it be fishing from the shore or fishing out on the boats. An absolutely brilliant rig that is one of my absolute favourites, and it's probably, depending if I've got the right conditions, which I'll talk about in a moment, my first choice when I go bass fishing, particularly fishing at short range. But for those of you that are new to sea fishing and new to rigs, basically what you've got here, this would be your leader, your line coming down from your rod tip, and then thread on your leader is some sort of boom, a small boom or a lead clip that runs free on the line like that, which gives its name running ledger. So in theory, because this runs free, a fish could come along and pick up the bait and swim away a little while with that bait before actually feeling any resistance from the rod tip, from you and the rod tip. Particularly if you've got your reel on free spool, let's say you're using a bait runner, or maybe you've got your reel set on the clicker so a fish can actually take line, which is a way we fish for gilthead bream, but it's all very useful for bass as well. So after the boom, there's a bead, a small bead. And what the bead is there for is to protect the knot there on the swivel at the top of the trace. So that when this is moving and that lead and boom are banging against the knot of the top of the swivel at the top of the trace there, it helps to protect that knot. So then we've got our swivel at the top of the trace, and then we've got our trace. Now, I very rarely use more than 30-pound test line for a trace. Usually 30-pound, and usually use either this, which is clear amnesia, or fluorocarbon. But the length of the traces I've found with bass fishing is quite important. And I like to make it at least 3 foot long, 3 to 5 foot long, again to give that fish more chance to pick up that bait without feeling any resistance. But when it comes to hooks, bass have got big mouths, even small bass, and tend to fish with big baits. So the hook size I use is normally between 3 and 5/0. Sometimes a single hook and sometimes 2 hooks, a pennel, a pennel setup, particularly if I'm using very, very big baits. So for example, what I would do, let's say if I was using worm for bait, I'd probably have a 3/0 hook, either a single hook and thread a few worms on the hook and up the line. But if I'm using a very big bait, let's say about sort of 8 inches of worm, then probably have another hook, a pennel hook here, so you've got to hook both ends to increase your chances of a hook up. But if it was baits, let's say like some peeler crab or some clam, or maybe a whole medium-sized sand eel, then I'd probably up the hook to a 4/0 or even a 5/0. Try to fish single hook, but if necessary, fish 2 hooks. So that's the rig. But now to the important thing is when and why to use this. Now I like to use this when I'm fishing short range. I'm literally just having to lob a bait out only, let's say, 30, 40 yards, because I know the fish are very, very close. And also putting it out on clean ground. The bait's going to go on clean ground. It may be close to rough ground, but it sits on clean ground. And if you're playing a fish in, you don't have to play it over a load of boulders and a load of rocks where you could get snagged. But also if the conditions are relatively calm. Now, what I mean by that, I don't mean that the sea's got to be flat calm. What I mean, let's say it's not really surfy. Because you put a rig like this with fairly long trace, running ledger into the surf, you can get a lot of tangles. So relatively calm conditions. But also when you know the bass are not taking hard, they're quite tentative. And I can give you an example of this. Now, years ago, it'd be well over 30 years ago, when I was a lot younger and I didn't mind going out at all hours at night to fish and still get up and go to work the next day. I don't do that now. If I go night fishing now, it has to be in the autumn when it gets dark quick. But I used to do it night after night years ago, mainly fishing beaches which were normally surf beaches. But sometimes you would fish those beaches and it was actually flat calm. There was no surf, but the fish were still there. Now I can remember when I got educated, as you do, on bass, being on one of those beaches when it was calm, and realising that the bites were coming very, very close to dry land. The bass were moving in very, very close to dry land, only say 20 yards out, and just working along the shoreline. Fishing with something like a fixed paternoster, where you tend to get an immediate indication that the fish that you got a bite, and getting very, very, very gentle bites, just gentle tap, tap, and then nothing. Tap, tap, and then nothing. And this would go on and on and on, really frustrating, because just could not get a fish to pick up the bait and actually go with it. So I thought, right, the next night, what I'll do is I'll fish, forget the paternoster, I'll put the running ledger on with a decent length trace, say 3-4 foot trace. Did that, got down, and again, just literally lob the bait out very close, knowing that the fish would come in really close in those calm conditions. And then stand back, hold the rod. I like to hold the rod if I'm on the surf beaches. Hold a rod, and then as soon as I felt that gentle tap tap, is lower the rod tip down, lower the rod tip, so you're giving slack to enable that fish not to get spooked, to be able to pick a bait up and then swim off with it. And what would happen, you get the tap tap, you lower the rod tip down, and then you could sense it, you could feel that the fish had picked the bait up and was moving off with it, and then you could strike. And then I could catch them. So there's one occasion where you need a rig where you can give a fish time. I've also been lucky enough to see bass, big bass, feeding, standing up high, looking down on a beach, which was like a boulder beach with very low rocks, but in shallow water, say only 2 or 3 foot of water, and watching a solo big bass. It would have been probably near double figures, with its head down and its tail up, just rummaging through the stones and the rocks, probably looking for the crabs, looking for the little fish that sit under the rocks, etc. But really slowly, in no rush whatsoever, on its own, not competing with other bass, like a shoal of school bass, competing with each other, first in, grab it and go away with it. It had all the time in the world. So if you were trying to fish those conditions and you were fishing close to those rocks, this sort of rig is perfect for it, because you can feel that gentle bite and give that fish time before it gets spooked to pick up that bait and actually hook it. Now, there's a brilliant book by Dr. Mike Ladle and Alan Vaughan, and it's called Hooked on Bass. And this book, I think it came out in about the late 80s, maybe early 90s. I'm not sure. But this book talks about situations where they're fishing maybe close to shallow rocky ground, where they know the bass take very, very lightly. Fishing running ledgers with fishing a trace of about 5 foot long, so again, to give it a chance. And having to do exactly that, just feeling the gentle tap of the bass, and then having to lower that rod tip and give it time until you feel it move off with it and hook them that way. If you haven't read that book, it's a bit dated when it comes to maybe modern lure fishing and the lures we use nowadays, but it doesn't matter. Everything is still relative, and it's an absolutely brilliant book and a real education. So that's the running ledger. So I would use it close range, lobbing a bait out, reasonable calm conditions. When I know that the bass are not going to be hitting the baits hard, when I want that little bit of give to give that bass chance of taking the bait before being spooked. And that was when I use a running ledger. If I'm out on the kayak and I was, let's say, anchored and I'm wanting to, in fairly shallow water, bass fishing, casting a bait in shallow water, away from the kayak, maybe closer to some rocks, again, I would use a running ledger, either with a plain lead, or if need be, if there's quite a strong current, then a grip lead. The next rig that I've had a lot of success with over the years is this rig, and it's known as the flapper rig. So again, for beginners, just to explain this rig, you've got your leader here coming down from your rod tip, and at the end of that leader is a clip, so that you can clip the rig on. But the rig itself, at the top of the rig, you've got a swivel there, and then after that is threaded on a small bead, and then a swivel is thread on, which holds the trace to your hook. That's not tied on, it's just thread on so that it can rotate. It can rotate all the way around. It's also known as a butterfly rig, and that helps prevent tangles. And then after that is another small bead, and that is trapped on the trace by, in my case, I've got a couple of rig stops there to fix it in place at the top of the rig. And what I like to do is just add a little bit of super glue to those rig stops to keep it nice and solid. But you could use a crimp is another way you could do it, whatever, but that's trapped at the top of the rig. And coming off that swivel that rotates like that is the line, and again I've got 30-pound amnesia, which goes down to the hook, either a single hook again or two hooks, a panel rig, depending on the size of the bait. But going back to the main body, which is the breaking strain of the main body is a suitable size for the leads that you'll cast in. Now where I fish, I very rarely need more than 4 ounces. So this is 40-pound clear amnesia. But if you're using 6 ounces, you would need to use 60-pound as your main body, so that it doesn't break under the strain of casting. But the distance between the trace there at the top of the rig down to a link which is tied at the bottom of the rig, I like to make it at least 3 foot. And the reason I'll explain in a moment. Okay, now the when to use and where to use this rig. Now this is a rig that I like to use on the surf beaches when you're fishing in the surf. Again, it's not clipped down, it's a flapper, so when you cast the bait out, the bait is flapping in the air. But again, distance is not the objective. As long as you can get this out, let's say 50, 60 yards, that's more than enough, particularly on you've got an incoming tide. So even if you only lobbed it out 30 yards, with the incoming tide, particularly on the shallow beaches that I fish, where the tide moves in quickly, shallow water, you're constantly backing up anyway. So you don't need to have to cast it out. You can lob it out, say 30 yards, 40 yards, just stand back and move. You're moving back anyway, so the bait is coming further and further out, but you don't need to. Usually, again, if the bass are there, usually say 60 yards, well, certainly 80 yards at the most is more than enough to cover the fish. So it's a rig used on surf beaches, and the reason for that is because if you're fishing in the surf, you can imagine your bait is out there and your rig is like being in a washing machine. It's being, you've got all that turbulent white water constantly moving, and it's just like in a washing machine. So you need a rig that doesn't tangle easily. And because this swivel rotates all the way around like that, hence the name butterfly, it means because it does that, there's less chance of it tangling because it can move. So it sits, you cast it out in relatively shallow water, it sits, it's usually use a grip lead on these, it's sitting lying on the seabed like that, and because that can rotate and because it's like being in a washing machine, it can move, it can rotate, there's less chance of it tangling. But when it comes to the length of the trace, again, I like to have where the trace sits at least 3 foot away from the lead, but I like to use a fairly short trace when I'm using this type of rig. And again, another reason is that it's keeping the bait well away from the lead, which is sitting there 3 foot away. But also the short trace, again, it helps to prevent tangles when you're fishing in that washing machine turbulent water. So usually only about a foot. Now when you're surf fishing, this is fixed, unlike the running ledger. But the idea is that this is a self-hooking rig. Now, bass usually when they're feeding in the surf, not always, but most times they take quickly. They have to, because if they're after that piece of bait that's been washed out the sand, it's in that turbulent water, that fast-moving water, white water, it's going to be washed around quickly. So they usually come in, pick up their bait quickly, and then immediately turn and move away with it. And that's when the bite indication is usually that strong pull, or quite often you'll get a slack liner where the bass has moved in, picked up the bait, turned away with it hard, tripped the grip lead, and then suddenly your line goes all slack. So it's fixed. So self-hooking, it's anchored with a grip lead, or you can use a plain lead if you want it to move around a bit, but basically the fish comes along, it picks up the bait quickly because it has to, it turns away, swims away with it, comes up against the resistance of the lead on the seabed, and then that pulls back, and usually it's self-hooking. So no striking involved, it's just basically hold the rod, you feel that pull, you get that slack liner, you take up the slack, and then usually 9 times out of 10 the fish would have hooked itself. So that's the rig that I tend to always use when in the surf, the flapper rig. The last bait rig that I'm going to talk about is this rig, which is the very well known and very popular pulley rig. Called a pulley rig because it operates just like a normal pulley system. Now there's a lot of components to this rig for me to try and explain, so what I suggest for you beginners is to go onto Google or go onto YouTube and do a YouTube search, pulley rig or how to tie a pulley rig, and That'll probably give you more detail than I can explain in a short while. But basically we've got our main body of the rig there, which is about 3 foot long. And then I'll start down the lead end of the rig. So tied to the bottom of the rig is, in my case, it's what is known as a breakaway imp, which does two things. It holds the lead, but it also enables you to clip down the rig to make it more streamlined for those occasions when you do need to get that extra distance. So breakaway imp tied to the end, and then clipped onto the top of the breakaway imp, I've got a swivel. And then after the swivel is a bead, thread on a bead, and then the line is then thread through. In my case, it's a proper pulley bead. Now you can, if you want to save money, you can use just an ordinary swivel and thread it through the swivel. But I find the proper pulley beads, using the proper pulley beads actually works better. So it's thread through there, and then if we go to the other end where we've got our snood, our trace, another bead is thread on. Again, this is to protect knots. Then a swivel, which is at the top of your snood, and then your snood down to your hook. Again, either a single hook, or in this case, on this rig, it's two hooks, so it's actually called, it's a panel pulley. Now, when I would use this type of rig. Now, if I'm on a mark where I've got to cast my bait over some very, very rough ground, some rocks, rough ground, but out onto clean ground, but if I hook a fish, I've got to play that fish back over that rough ground, which obviously there's a risk of snagging. But this rig really comes into its own because it's on a pulley system. The fish, in theory, well, we hope it's heavier. The fish should always be heavier than the lead. So, for example, you hook a bass, you're playing it, you've got to play it over that rough ground, say a couple of pound bass. Because that fish is heavier, what will happen is it'll pull the lead up high like that. So we've got our leader coming down from our rod tip, this end, and we're playing the fish that end, and the fish is fighting this end, and its weight keeps that lead high. Whereas, let's say a normal rig, like maybe the running ledger we looked at, or a paternoster, a flapper type rig, where the lead is actually on the bottom of the rig, there's much more chance of that lead, as you'll keep wanting to drop down into those rocks and getting snagged. So it's absolutely fantastic setup for those situations. And I've done a video, I think it's probably about 3, nearly 4 years ago now, where I used this rig, where I was casting over sort of about 40 yards, had to cast over some really rocky ground out onto the clean ground, and actually playing fish, bass over those rocks. And it works well. Now, the other useful thing about this rig is because it's got that, it's clipped down. Just bear with me, I'll try and get this clipped on. Right, that's good. Because you can clip it down and it becomes streamlined like that, it is useful for those times when you do need that little bit of distance that I mentioned earlier. Those times when maybe you have got a feature that is further out than normal, that you want to try and place the bait by, and maybe it's a bit breezy, and the normal rig like a running ledger or the flapper just won't reach it. That's when this is also really useful, because it clips down and becomes streamlined and you can cast further with it. But even when I'm using this rig on those occasions when I only want to cast it, say 40, 50 yards over some rough ground, I usually clip it down anyway, because when it's clipped down, it helps to keep the bait together when in the air rather than when it's flapping around. So there we have the pulley rig. Last, I'm going to look at the lure rig that I've used for several years now. Very simple rig that I've found to be very effective. And actually it's more more like the setup that I use really, rather than a rig. But I use it for shore bass fishing I do, and kayak bass fishing, which all involves casting of the lures and retrieving. So I'll quickly go through the actual rod and reel. So I've got a pretty standard, this is an 8-foot lure rod. It's a 10 to 36 gram, which covers the range of lures that I tend to use. It's 8 foot. I know a lot of bass anglers use slightly longer rods, maybe 9 foot and 9.5 foot. But I use 8 foot mainly because 8 foot is sort of the maximum I want to use off the kayak. And it's fine from the shore as well. On that, pretty standard 4,000 size lure reel. In the UK, we tend to use 3.5 to 4,000 size. And the braid I normally use is between 15 and 20 pound. But down at the important end, joined to the braid, I've got a rubbing leader. And that's about 2.5 to 3 foot long, and it's 15 pound fluorocarbon. I usually use between 15 and 20 pound at the most. Now this is a rubbing leader, and this is for you beginners. It's not a shock leader. The strength of the braid is more than strong enough to cope with the weight of the lures that I cast. So it's a rubbing leader, which basically means that if you're playing a fish, let's say most bass fishing that I do these days is over rough ground. So if you're playing a fish and that fish dives into the rough ground and you get close to the rocks, the fluorocarbon, or if you use nylon, is more abrasive resistant than the braid. So it acts just like that as a rubbing leader, or if it gets wrapped around the scales of a fish, it's less likely to break than the braid. But going to the knot that joins the two together, these days I tend to use one of three. The FG knot, or the uni-to-uni knot, or I think it's called the Albright knot, or the improved Albright knot. Now I used to just use a uni-to-uni knot, but then of course this FG knot came along, which everyone raved about, and it has been proven that it's the strongest knot that there is to join braid to fluorocarbon. But it is slightly more complicated to tie than, let's say, the uni-to-uni knot. I wouldn't say it's terribly, once you got used to doing it, it's okay. But what I tend to do is, when I'm setting these leaders up at home, which I tend to do anyway, I put a new leader on, what I'll do is tie the FG knot, because it's easier for me to do at home. Very strong knot, and it's very, very thin. So it is a great knot. So I'll do it at home, but if I'm out fishing and I get a snag and I get a break off, I want to get back fishing quick, and I know there's fish around, get back fishing quick, then what I will tend to do is go back and tie the uni-to-uni knot, because it's so easy, and so easy to tie out in the field, or even the Albright knot is a lot easier to cast, to tie. And down at the end of the rubbing leader, just a clip, whatever clip you want to use, lots of good clips on the market, a clip to be able to clip the lures on and change them when you want to. So a very, very simple setup that works really well. So that's it. That's an insight of the RIGS that I found to be my most successful over many years and using them in different situations. Now I know, of course, there's others that use plenty of other rigs that they will swear by, but those are the ones that I've had plenty of success with. It's absolutely tipping down a rain outside, and it's blowing an absolute gale, so absolutely no chance of doing any fishing. So it's been handy actually to use this time that I've got to come into the shed here and do a bit of tackle talk. And fingers crossed, later on in the year, all being well, get out and do that more bass fishing this year. And I know a lot of you like the bass fishing videos. So once again, I hope you found that useful, and many, many thanks for watching.